Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, let's learn. Preemptive like. My name's Connor. If you're new, the original link to the video from War Graphics, top of the description. Hope everyone's doing well. Let's get started. The Security Council needs urgent reform. Here's how.
Club on Earth, a group of world policemen.
You know how there are permanent members on the Security Council? Are they? It seems like the permanent members of the Security Council seem to be, some of the more powerful countries in the world. Is that why they're permanent members, or like why doesn't it just rotate? Is it because they don't trust? I don't know. Let's go.
Last paper. It's perhaps the most powerful club on Earth. A group of world policemen tasked with working together to provide global stability. The most important body in the United Nations, the Security Council, was set up in the aftermath of World War II to peacefully resolve international disputes. Under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, it's the only UN body with the power to make binding international laws and the only body that can authorize an armed intervention into a conflict zone. As such, someone with little grasp of geopolitics might be forgiven for thinking this is where real power lies. Yet, in our current era, they'd most likely be mistaken. Far from setting the agenda in 2024, the UN Security Council is mostly paralyzed to the point of uselessness.
I think a lot of these types of organizations and committees that we have around the world to prevent stuff like World War I and World War II happening again and other bad things. Not to say there haven't been horrible conflicts since World War II. Of course there have. But I think, unfortunately, the more we are removed from say, World War II, when everyone, has it fresh in their memory how chaotic and destructive it was, I think it humanity has a shorter memory than I would like it to have, I guess. And yeah, I think these things become less effective as we're more removed from horrible conflicts. And that's a scary thought, but...
Presenting at any given time a mere 8% of the world's nations, today's council is seen by many rising powers as little more than a relic, a fossil of geopolitics, as they were in 1945, frozen forever in amber. At the same
that is what I was trying to say, and he just said it way better in much fewer words.
time, bitter divides between its veto-wielding members, mostly Russia, China, and the USA, have left it incapable of fulfilling its functions. In short, it's clear that the Security Council is in need of major reform. The only question is how.
Just before we continue with today's episode, I want to give a huge shout out to our sponsor, Keeps. Now look, I'm not exactly the poster child for hair loss prevention, but that doesn't mean
Your beard is fantastic, though.
shouldn't take action. It's just
If this interests you guys and you learn about it here or thought about getting it from here, make sure to use the promo codes and links, guys.
late
All right?
for me.
Original
My
link
hair's not
to the video,
coming
top
back.
description.
Isn't it sad? But that
Promo
doesn't have
codes
to
in
be
their
the case
description.
with you, because Keeps is an online subscription service that makes it super easy and affordable for men to treat male pattern baldness right from the comfort of their home. No need to visit a doctor's office or a pharmacy. Everything is done online, whether you're trying to prevent hair loss, stimulate hair growth, or just take better care of the hair you have. Keeps have got you covered. They offer clinically proven treatments personalized just for you, delivered right to your door. And guys, Keeps is discreet. They deliver everything in non-branded packaging, so your little secret stays that, a secret. Plus, you can adjust, pause, or cancel your plan at any time. It's just that flexible. With Keeps, you complete an online consultation, get matched with a licensed medical provider who tailors a treatment plan to your specific needs. It's all based on science, and most men start seeing results within just 6 months. They've treated over 1 million men in the last 6 years and have over 5,000 5-star reviews. So, if you're ready to take action against hair loss, head to keeps.com/Simon or click the link in the description below. That's keeps.com/Simon. That's me. And thanks to Keeps for sponsoring this video.
Honestly, I'm very pessimistic about the possibility of any sort of reform to create a more effective Security Council, because it's getting to the point where countries are just weaponizing conflicts around the world for other countries. It's like, why do you think that, China and Russia and the United States and, Great Britain, a lot of, why do you think they always seem to be on opposite sides of any conflict? It's getting to the point where, you know, safety of around the world is not the main objective. It's just how can we gain influence with others to paint our adversary as the bad guy, and the adversaries just happen to be the members, permanent members of the council. So I'm curious to see what suggestions might come up in the video.
When the victorious nations of World War II set out to build a new international order, they must have felt like they were creating something that could last forever. That's because the United Nations wouldn't just be a talking shop successor to the failed League of Nations, but a body with actual teeth. Teeth that came in the form of the tanks, bullets, and shells belonging to the world's most powerful nations. Sat alongside the UN General Assembly, these nations would form the core permanent members of the new Security Council. Known as the P5, they comprise two rising superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, two fading imperial powers, Britain and France, and, at the insistence of the United States, the Republic of China, at that time still a few years shy of Mao's communist takeover. As conceived by President Franklin D. Roosevelt,
for the
the
US.
five would act as policemen, watching over the world and helping find peaceful resolutions to conflicts, but ready to step in with force if necessary. Amid the unsteady optimism of the post-war era, many must have willed themselves to believe in this vision. After all, the P5 were the globe's premier nations, spanning continents. If anyone could use a combination of soft power and muscle to resolve disputes, it was them. Yet, had any of those involved in the Security Council's founding been able to see forward to our current era, they would have been disappointed. That's because the Security Council in 2024 is an organization that seems incapable of providing any security. Even as multiple crises mushroom up around the world, it has authorized only 2 deployments in the
It's bad faith. I'm just going to say it. I think it's bad faith. This guy hates this guy. This country hates this country over here. And so it's bad faith. They don't care about aiding conflicts if it's happening in an area that, you know, it benefits them not to intervene. And they will call out countries that they're adversaries of that they want to make look bad. It's the only way it can work is if everyone wants to be a good faith actor in this room, which, how does that happen? I mean, how do you do that?
Is an organization that seems incapable of providing any security. Even as multiple crises mushroom up around the world, it has authorized only 2 deployments in the last decade, a stabilization mission to the Central African Republic and a policing mission to Haiti that failed to even get off the ground before the country collapsed. At the same time, the veto powers of the P5 members have stopped international action being taken against some of the biggest wars of our time. Russia, for example, has vetoed any and all resolutions on the Ukraine war, while the United States has used its own veto to stop any action on the war in Gaza. Even when the Council succeeds in passing resolutions, they often fail to make a difference. This year, the body called for a Ramadan ceasefire in Sudan, where a brutal civil war rages. Neither side took any notice. All of which is why today's Council feels less like a group of world policemen and more like an ineffectual talking shop, one as weak and neutered as the League of Nations prior to World War II. And we'll circle back around later to the flaws with the Council as it stands today, as well as various possible methods for fixing it. Before we get into that, though, we do need to quickly fill in some of the background to make sure we all understand exactly what we're talking about today. Because, like many UN bodies, the Security Council is more complicated than it might initially seem. The first thing to note is that the Council is far larger than just the P5. While the P5 are the guys with the permanent seats and vetoes, there are also another 10 elected members. Serving 2-year, non-consecutive terms, these elected members must be voted in by 2/3 of the UN General Assembly. Although none of them can veto
Interesting. So it's not just a random kind of
resolutions, be voted in by 2/3 of the UN General Assembly.
So why isn't every member? I think I know the answer. I think most people do. I just want to say it out loud. Why is it that there are permanent members of the Security Council, and why is it that they have to? Why isn't it just, 12 people? Every country gets a seat, and you switch off every year or something. It's because at the end of the day, there's a bigger game being played above all of this, which is just geopolitical power and wanting to get above other people. And to have everyone ignore that bigger game is just impossible. So yeah,
Assembly. Although none of them can veto resolutions, they are still able to craft international law on matters of peace and security. They also take turns at assuming the rotating presidency, which gets a new head every month. The Council on Foreign Relations notes that this ensures some agenda-setting influence for its 10 non-permanent members. As to gets to become a non-permanent member, you won't be surprised to hear that political considerations play an almighty role. Since 1965, members have been elected based on regional groupings. Africa gets 3 seats. Asia Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and Western Europe and others will get 2 seats each, while Eastern Europe gets 1. While this might sound quite representative, in other ways, it really isn't. The Economist points out that whereas the Council included 22% of General Assembly members in 1945, it now has just 8%. This is a result of swaths of new countries emerging, thanks to stuff like decolonization, the breakup of empires, and nations like Yugoslavia disintegrating into smaller parts. To be fair, the UN is trying to address this. There's been talk flying around for years now about adding more seats and trying to get more representation from underserved parts of the world. But this still wouldn't change the salient fact that the P5 themselves are all drawn from just 3 continents: North America, Europe, and Asia. Latin
1 second, guys. Let me just get a new. Hold on. Okay. Sorry.
America and Africa have no permanent members, and while East Europe, the P5 themselves are all drawn from just 3 continents: North America, Europe, and Asia. Latin America and Africa have no permanent members, and while East Asia is represented in the form of China, which took over from Taiwan in 1971, South Asia is likewise excluded. This is a core complaint of
India.
middle or rising powers such as
Surprise
India.
India's not
They're
on there.
stuck living in a world in which they can have large economies, bigger populations, or bigger armies than, say, Russia or Britain, but they're still stuck in a world in which decisions made in Moscow or London carry more weight. However, as we'll see later, fixing this isn't as easy as just adding some extra seats, nor can the Council's problems be laid solely at the feet of the P5. In their own way, the non-permanent members are also responsible for the Council's descent into utter dysfunction. Perhaps the most famous role the Security Council has is authorizing military interventions, in the words of the UN Charter, to maintain or restore international peace and security. The most recent intervention to be authorized was the deployment of a Kenyan-led force to Haiti to tackle gangs. But there are plenty of past examples to choose from. The Council on Foreign Relations currently lists 60 operations undertaken since 1991. At the time of writing, 11 deployments are ongoing, covering hotspots as diverse as Cyprus, Kosovo,
I thought I had to sneeze. I did have to, and then I didn't.
The Council on Foreign Relations currently lists 60 operations undertaken since 1991. At the time of writing, 11 deployments are ongoing, covering hotspots as diverse as Cyprus, Kosovo, Lebanon, Western Sahara, South Sudan, or the border between India and Pakistan. Nor are these missions generally led by the United States. According to the CFR, Nepal contributes the most personnel, followed by Bangladesh, India, and Rwanda. But while this might sound like a global body that's acting as it should do, these, in reality, are the rare successes. Of the 11 current deployments, a mere 4 were authorized this century. As we mentioned last chapter, only 2 have been authorized in the last decade. To be clear, for those who've spent the last 10 years blissfully unaware of the news, that's not because the period since 2004 has been particularly peaceful. Rather, it's because the act of signing off on an intervention in other states has become politically fraught. As Foreign Policy notes, the current world order is so fragmented that nations have a hard time agreeing on when it's acceptable to make demands of one another. From the outside,
I think that we need to stop. I think we need to realize and not kind of kid ourselves that we are this. That this is some, higher. Think about, okay, you don't want miscommunication to happen and wars to happen unnecessarily, and you want to create a committee where countries around the world can come together and talk with each other, hey, what's going on, before anything bad happens, right? That's what it is at the end of the day. It's not some magic ordained peacekeeping thing that so I always think that people should always remember that in my opinion here, that the peacekeeping and the UN is secondary to the main game being played between countries that is nasty, that is very there's so much disagreement, and at the end of the day, it's not just that countries just want power. They want power because they want, their safety. They want to keep their status quo. They want to keep their quality of life, their power, right? That's what every country wants to do. And so I think it will only, I think that always has to be pushed to the forefront of these conversations. Yes, this is a committee designed to make sure that needless conflict doesn't break out and we can agree on stuff. But at the end of the day, China and the USA and Russia disagree on things. France and India, I'm just picking like random countries, disagree on things. And so at the end of the day, it's countries around the world's interests shouldn't be made like they aren't there because of this magical peacekeeping committee that we have, organization. Does that make sense? We're kidding ourselves if anyone thinks that this is just it's going to work and everyone wants what is best for every other country. That's just nonsense, and that has never been the case that I'm aware of. And look at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. What was it? The Council of Vienna or something? Metternich and Castlereagh and all them. And, look, we can't have this happening. But at the end of the day, countries don't want to stay in the status quo where there are super powerful countries like Britain and France. Well, Germany wants to be super powerful. And so what do? They take, they unify Germany. They go to war against France, German unification. World War I starts so at the end of the day, countries don't want to just have their current power status. The USA might, China might. Well, China wants to grow, but super powerful. And I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that the current state of the world, every country is happy with what it has. Look at Ethiopia, for example, okay? They're having some issues with Egypt, but I'm talking about mainly Somalia, where Somalia has this kind of breakaway northern province that is doing deals with Ethiopia, and Ethiopia wants a port, okay? They want a port. Ethiopia is currently landlocked. They want access to the Red Sea or the Indian Ocean, right? And who am I to say as America, no, you can't have that. Do you want to know why we can't have that? Because the current order suits us. We want the borders to stay as they are, and we will attack you. We will prevent you, sanction you, maybe attack you if you try. Well, Ethiopia might think, okay, well, give me some of your coastline then. Give me Florida. And of course, the USA is going to say, well, no, that's ridiculous. Of course I'm not giving you Florida. Well, then I'm going to roll the dice and invade Somalia and try and hold it off and get it. And at the end of the day, that is the true game, in my opinion, okay? China wants to take over Taiwan. Russia wants to take over Ukraine. These are things that people, of course, they're horrible things, but they are par for the course of human history, okay? What is not par for the course is a peace committee working indefinitely, okay? And so I'm not saying that we should just give up and everyone goes to war again. I'm not saying that. But to try and think that every border around the world today is just the perfectly ordained state of the world that has to be kept in check is ridiculous, in my opinion. If you want that to be the case, then, hey, America, give up some of your coastline. Of course, I'm American. I never want America to do that. I'm trying to make a point that if I'm a place like Ethiopia, or like Bolivia that wants a coastline that from Chile or whatnot, I want that. And okay, well, no. Okay, then give me some of yours. No, well, then I guess we're going to war. That, at the end of the day, if anyone wants eternal peace, then you have to have eternal unanimous agreement with every country on earth, which means somehow giving every country on earth equal access to all resources and all areas in the world so that everyone's equal. Until then, why are we even talking about this? Until then, I don't understand how you can have this eternal peacekeeping process. Countries are inherently unequal because of past war. How is America so big? How is China so big? How is Russia so big? Because land was taken and it was conquered and taken over. And now we're trying to live in a time period where we want to act like, nope, that game is over. Okay. You know the game, you know the entire human history of borders changing and people taking over other places? That's over. Well, you can't just stop the game when you have a perfect playing field, you know? That's just not how it's going to work. And again, I want to bring up like Germany as a good example. Germany started World War II. I'm sorry, World War I. Oh, sorry. There's some disagreement on whether Germany started World War I. The point is Germany was kind of seeming like they were ready for a fight. They wanted to be on the same level as Britain, as France. Well, Britain and France aren't going to do that. Well, Germany, okay, then guess we're going to war or something like that. I know that's not how World War I was started, but I'm saying Germany was clearly ready to fight. And you can't just want world peace and then say other countries need to accept the lesser status that they have. That doesn't work that way. I'm sorry.
Reasons why often seem positive. No one in the 2020s is comfortable with European and North American nations trying to tell African countries what to do for really good historical reasons. Unfortunately, this has led to situations where...
Oh, sorry. I'm going on. I'm...
Trying to do for really good historical reasons. Unfortunately, this has led to situations where crises in Africa get effectively ignored. To take just one recent example, when Sudan descended into civil war in April of 2023, it seemed like just the sort of situation where the council might be able to make a difference. After all,
no, because this is why no difference made. Okay, is look at why does the USA support Israel? Why does China agree more with Palestine? Do you think why? It's because it's in the geopolitical interest of China to support Palestine, to a strong American ally in Israel, kind of weaken them, show the world what they're doing. And it's in the interest of America to support Israel in the same way. China is no less, I'm not saying, China and USA have no more righteous cause to support one side or the other. It's geopolitics. Okay, sorry.
It seemed like
chill.
Just the sort of situation.
Oh, sorry. And the reason why this isn't is because there's not as much attention on these things, and there's no obvious reason for giant powers to use this conflict in a way that doesn't hurt the other.
Where the council might be able to make a difference. After all,
always, guys, make sure to, if I said anything wrong you disagree with, I would love to hear it.
The war's opening weeks, none of the veto-wielding P5 had particularly strong incentives to block a resolution. No,
what's
what
in it for them?
Stopped any action was the A3 group of African members. The crisis group explains that when the council turns to African affairs, generations of African council members have complained that the European former colonial powers dominate these discussions. As a result, the A3 now tend to oppose interventions in Africa, arguing that the African Union Peace and Security Council should be responsible for the continent instead. Unfortunately, the AU is currently drifting into a policy of non-interference in its members' internal affairs. So, Sudan's civil war has now grown to become one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters, while another conflict, the A3 blocked action on the Tigray War, wound up becoming the deadliest war in decades. Now, to be clear, we're not saying the A3 are uniquely obstructive. We're just using their example as a way to highlight how good intentions such as not letting former colonial powers dictate African affairs can lead to unambiguously bad outcomes. Another major issue is that even when the council speaks, fewer and fewer states seem willing to listen. We talked last chapter about how a proposed Ramadan ceasefire in Sudan was ignored, but there are other examples such as Mali's junta recently ordering UN peacekeepers to leave the country despite high levels of violence. Other times, the slow-moving nature of the council itself means that events often overtake its deliberations. When Azerbaijan blockaded the ethnically Armenian enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh last year, the Security Council called multiple emergency sessions, but these proceeded at such a glacial pace that no resolutions had been passed by the time Azerbaijan launched its full-scale invasion on September 19th. So instead of action, you got stuff like this strangely anodyne meeting on September the 21st in which
I think a big step would be to acknowledge, this sounds bad at first, but I think it would actually have a good effect, to acknowledge that this is not some moral police, okay? This is not a group of moral policemen whose job it is to make sure there's less suffering in the world, okay? The point of this should be countries, we are allies and adversaries, we live on the same planet, and this is a way for us to discuss things so there's less needless war. I think that would actually have a better effect because there would be less subversive geopolitics going on with the cover of some sort of peacekeeping force or morality police. It's like, why do you think the USA supports Israel? Why do you think the USA supports Ukraine? Why do you think China supports Russia against Ukraine? Why do you think India kind of sits on both sides? It's all geopolitically smart for their respective decisions to do that. And whenever people say like, the US is being moral and going and standing with Ukraine, or China is being moral for standing with Palestinians, no, they're not. They're supporting the side that helps their greater geopolitical goal, the game that is really the more important game that countries are playing.
Council representatives said things like this: the only solution to the crisis is to end violence. In fact, by that point, the crisis had already been solved by a resounding Azerbaijani victory. Speaking of foreign policy, the UN Director of International Crisis Group recently lamented that in the absence of real diplomacy, quote, the UN is a platform for governments to vent and cast symbolic votes.
Yeah.
However, for all the wider...
Wait.
Group recently lamented that in the absence of real diplomacy, quote, the UN is a platform for governments to vent and...
Honestly, yes. Maybe I'm being too pessimistic, but I think I'm just trying to be realistic here. Yes, and there's nothing wrong with this, okay? Because to try and get anything other than this, again, requires countries to agree on things in an unequal world. And it's not going to happen like that.
Cast symbolic votes. However, for all the wider council may be riddled with problems, we'd be kidding ourselves if we didn't say that the biggest issue lay with its permanent members, specifically in the power of veto. When the Security Council was first set up, one of the key ways to get the world's major powers to agree to its jurisdiction was by giving each of them the power to veto any resolution. That means that to this day, Washington, Beijing, Moscow, London, and Paris are all able to kill anything that comes before the Council, a power that no other capital on Earth has. Although we should be clear that not all members of the P5 wield that power in the same way. Historically, the big driver of veto usage was the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Today, Moscow and Washington still hold the record for the most vetoes, with Moscow torpedoing over 155 resolutions and the United States over 90. By comparison, the UK has only used its veto 32 times, China 20, and France a mere 18. However, that doesn't mean that each nation's usage has been static, moving to a regular timetable. Since the end of the Cold War, neither Paris nor London have utilized their vetoes. Not only that, but both capitals have also begged the other P5 members to use their own vetoes less. Clearly, these pleas have fallen on deaf ears. During the Cold War, China used its veto a grand total of 2 times, once while its seat was being held by the Republic of China, or what we'd call Taiwan. In the last decade, on the other hand, Beijing has wielded its power 11 times. But while China is upping the usage of its veto power, the worst offenders remain by far the United States and Russia, not just because of their willingness to use their veto, but because of the opportunistic way that they often deploy it.
Yeah.
This can be seen most clearly in a raft of recent resolutions from the Council calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Since the horrific events of October the 7th, 2023, there have been 5 attempts to make a ceasefire official UN policy. 3 of them were vetoed by the United States, the other 2 were vetoed by Russia with China's backing. What's absurd is that the objective
Sorry.
Objections, the other two were vetoed by Russia with China's backing. What's absurd is that the objections often came down to the language deployed, with the US killing off resolutions that didn't condemn Hamas for their October massacre and Russia killing off resolutions that did. The result is that, at the time of writing, there is still no ceasefire in Gaza, despite all P5 members agreeing to one in theory. Rather than actively solving a problem, it is an example of the Council instead being used for political messaging. Bad as this is, though, things are even more absurd where the Ukraine war is concerned. Twice now, Moscow has used its veto to shield itself from resolutions condemning its illegal invasion. As the Atlantic Council wrote, how can a country engaged in Europe's largest invasion since World War II and led by a man wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes be allowed to undermine an organization committed to maintaining world peace? More recently, on March the 28th, Russia separately used its veto to stop monitoring of North Korea's nuclear weapons program, a move widely assumed to be a quid pro quo after Pyongyang supplied Moscow with millions of artillery shells. These are just a couple of recent examples, but modern history is littered with others. Because a P5 member veto is absolute, there is no way to overturn it. And because the Security Council is the only UN body empowered to make binding law, there's no way to hold a country that misuses its veto to account. Summing up his view of the situation in 2023, President Erdogan of Turkey was blunt. The Security Council has ceased to be the guarantor of world security and has become a battleground for the political strategies of only 5 countries. If that's true, then
I agree 100%.
the political strategies of only 5 countries. If that's true, then the key question now is, can we fix it? Sadly, doing so may be more difficult than it looks.
Who thinks it looks incredibly difficult? It doesn't look easy. So that
by now, just about everyone admits the need for Security Council reform. Here's UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres speaking in 2023 on the issues with UN bodies in general, quoting, "The world has changed. Our institutions have not. We cannot effectively address problems as they are if institutions do not reflect the world as it is." But there's a big difference between saying we need to change things and actually changing things, for the very good reason that no one can really agree on what change should look like. The Carnegie Endowment for Peace has a good rundown of the current factions in the UN that each see different solutions to the Security Council's woes. Broadly, they can be divided into 3 blocks: the G4, the Uniting for Consensus Coalition, and the African Bloc. For the G4, the solution is simple. While the P5 members remain large economies, they are no longer the 5 biggest. So why not add more of the most developed nations to balance things out? It won't surprise you to learn that the G4, comprising India, Brazil, Japan, and Germany, think they are the ones who should be at it, creating a P9 with expanded veto powers. Indeed, some of the current P5 seem up for this. Since 2021, the UK has advocated for making Germany a permanent member. The main issue, of course, is that expanding the number of permanent members with veto powers might lead to more gridlock rather than less. Taking the example of Brazil, although it could apply to any of the G4, Carnegie notes that Brasilia has never explained how a permanent seat of its own would improve the Council's functioning. Another major issue is deciding who deserves to
it'll allow Brazil to do the same veto for their own geopolitical interests as the current 5 are doing. What do you
get a new seat of its own.
Am I being too pessimistic? I don't think I am.
Another major issue is deciding who deserves to get the new permanent seats, which is exactly why the Uniting for Consensus Coalition exists, to stop the G4 from getting what they want. Primarily composed of middle powers like South Korea, Mexico, Turkey, Poland, and Pakistan, the coalition is made up of countries that have a rival or an enemy in the G4 and don't want to see them get extra power. As a result, the coalition instead campaigns for expanding the number of elected seats on the council, envisioning a world in which the P5 are kept in check by 20 elected nations rather than 10. They also call for terms to be longer than 2 years and able to run consecutively. Again, though, it's hard to see how this plan would improve the council's functioning. While it would bring a greater diversity of voices, that wouldn't necessarily streamline things. All of which may be why the last bloc, the African Union, has a more straightforward mission. Rather than sort out the council in general, the bloc's 54 members are laser focused on a single issue: increasing African representation. Guided by a 2005 agreement known as the Esselwini Consensus, the bloc envisages the creation of 2 new permanent seats with full veto rights reserved exclusively for African nations, as well as the addition of 3 non-permanent seats for the continent. In this, they've been remarkably successful at getting attention. In 2023, France and China joined forces on the Council to call for the Esselwini Consensus to be implemented. This year, the US, Russia, and the UK suggested they could support a watered-down version, creating 1 new permanent seat for an African nation. The biggest problem with the proposal is that the African bloc can't decide among themselves which countries would be chosen. Obvious choices would be
Nigeria
South
comes
Africa
to
or
mind.
Nigeria, but as the Carnegie Endowment notes, they face opposition from regional competitors like Algeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Senegal, mirroring the dynamics that pit the G4 nations against their UFC rivals. These sorts of worries might be why some have suggested coming at the problem from a different angle. Instead of adding new permanent members, why not remove some of the P5 who don't deserve to be there? The most frequent candidates floated are France and Russia. France because it's no longer the great imperial power it once was, and Russia because Moscow is going increasingly rogue. In some versions of the proposal, both are simply removed from the Council, while in others France is replaced with the EU. Again though, we run into immediate difficulties. To change the makeup of the Security Council, you need not just a 2/3 majority of the UN General Assembly, but also the agreement of every single member of the P5. And while it's just about possible, although unlikely to imagine a future in which Paris begrudgingly steps aside for the EU, the odds of Putin waking up tomorrow and going, maybe I have too much power, well, that's effectively zero, isn't it? All of which may be why certain nations are turning to blue sky ideas for reform. Reforms that wouldn't just add a few members to the council here or remove a few members there, but would force it to undertake wholesale reform. Of all the possible ways of fixing the Security Council, and trust me, there are a lot of them, perhaps none is so pleasing as the idea of copying the Premier League. England's major football league, the Premier League is incredibly Darwinian in its approach. Every season, even the biggest name clubs theoretically have a chance of getting relegated, while there's plenty of room for smaller teams to fight their way up into its hallowed ranks. So, the thinking goes, why not do something similar with the P5? Rather than maintain their power for all eternity based on their strength in 1945, why not have their membership automatically adjusted so nations rise and fall based on pre-agreed variables? Exactly what those variables could be is up for debate, but some examples are national GDP or defense expenditure. So Germany or India might be like Leicester City in the 2015 to 2016 season, soaring to the top of the Premier League, while Russia might be like Leicester City in the 2022 to 2023 season, getting relegated to the championships. Obviously, while such a system would be
military expenditure sounds a little more risky than GDP as a metric to decide, because that'll cause a lot of people to want to increase their military spending a lot to have that powerful seat, and even more armed world doesn't sound very safe. But on the other hand, it does make sense that, people with the largest military have the most power to throw around, and so might get on. It makes sense, but it's kind of scary.
It's hard to imagine any of the 3 fading European powers, France, Russia, or the UK, voting to implement it. And you can imagine all sorts of technical fights about how to exactly calculate who was in and who was out. That's why others think a much simpler solution could be in order, handing more power to the General Assembly. Unlike the Security Council, the General Assembly is where every recognized nation sits, with each of its 193 countries able to vote on resolutions. While it's not perfect, as the absence of Taiwan and others attest, it's also a lot fairer. With every country having a voice and no one having a veto, you could potentially empower the General Assembly to be the final arbitrator on world affairs. Nor would it necessarily be all that damaging for the P5, since all are wealthy and significant enough to wield their soft power behind the scenes to influence votes. On the other hand, Crisis Group points out that a 193-member body might simply be too slow and unwieldy to react in a timely manner to a conflict. A good example would be the Ukraine war, where 2 years of fighting has so far only produced a couple of strongly worded resolutions against Russia's invasion. Hardly the sort of thing to have Putin quaking in terror. And all of this brings us to our next proposal, this one via The Conversation, an idea that we'll nickname the Cynic's Proposal.
Just in mind, I think the best approach, okay, and I'm no expert on geopolitics, but this is my thoughts. I think the best approach to, if not even reforming, just re-imaging the Security Council, I think the best approach is to be very upfront about the geopolitical interests of countries on the council and every country in the world. I think, although it might seem like a good idea at first to just be like, this is the Committee for Peace, or this is an organization about fairness and peace. I think it needs to be an organization where everyone recognizes other people want to, make sure their country is doing well and their political interests are being solved before they solve anyone else's. Or I think hey, I want some things, you don't want some things. Let's not act like we're voting on things for any moral purpose, okay? I think being upfront about our disingenuousness, is that a word? I think being upfront about our legitimate differences and how we approach the world is the best course of action. Because I think treating it in some other way where we're not thinking about our geopolitical interests as much as just keeping the world as peaceful as possible, that'll lead to just a lot of mistrust and like sort of we're kidding ourselves. And I think that'll lead to more conflict. I think being as honest with each other as possible is the best course of action. Not going up there and being like, whatever conflict someone that a country you don't like is supporting, like, this is why they're bad for that. As opposed to, yes, the greater picture of things, this aids me. It does not aid my adversary very well, and so I'm kind of pursuing that. We need to recognize with each other that the world does not agree with each other. Okay, we do not agree on a lot of stuff, but we need to live with each other with as little conflict as possible, and that needs to be pushed forward. Not some sort of like, this is the cure to human conflict. That I'm sorry, but that's not possible until everyone agrees on everything. If you want world peace, then what happens when countries disagree? Okay, well, there's a council that votes on it, and they voted it, they can't do it. Okay, and when that country says, no, I'm not following that, okay, sanctions. If the sanctions don't work that much and they still have other strong countries that they can do trade with, now what? Well, war is what happens. And so that's the biggest problem. I think we need to be real with each other around the world, and like, we need to work with each other rather than we need to be the judges of righteousness around the world, because that's living in fantasy land, in my opinion, and will only lead to unintended results. Be real with each other. This is a council to try and avoid as much conflict as possible and mutual understanding, not some magical cure to world violence. I think that's what I'm
It can
trying to say.
basically be summed up as, we should all just expect less from the UN. The argument goes that making any meaningful change is impossible while the P5 hold their vetoes and while middle powers are unable to agree.
I wouldn't say that's what I was saying. I wouldn't say expect less from the UN. That's not really what I'm saying. I'm just saying I don't think we need to expect less. I think you are expecting an unreasonable amount. I guess that is saying expect. I think that there is an unreasonable faith there is an unreasonable amount of faith in the UN.
Deserves promotion to the top table. So why not just stop investing our hopes in the Security Council to have any impact on the world's problems? Or as the article put it, maybe it's time we start treating the UN for what it is, a diplomatic congress aimed at making the world a little better through encouraging cooperation, rather than what we hope it to be, a world government capable
Okay, I guess that is what I'm sort of saying, yes.
of effecting peace.
That doesn't mean give up. Well, it means giving up on unreasonable solutions.
Fatalistic view of the situation, isn't it? But sadly, it may also be the most realistic. As the New York Times notes, quote, the UN's founding charter was designed to make alterations extremely difficult. In the whole 78-year history of the Security Council, there have just been 2 major changes. When 4 new non-permanent seats were added in the 1960s, and when China took over Taiwan's seat in the 1970s. That being the case, perhaps we should just take what we can get where the Security Council is concerned, laud it when it manages to get its act together, but otherwise pay it less heed and not expect it to sort out our problems. Because the alternative, perhaps the only way to force through the serious reforms it clearly needs, might involve giving the system a shock so big it could struggle to survive. As Carnegie Endowment notes, transformational change in world politics is most likely in the aftermath of catastrophes when a major crisis wipes the slate clean.
I 100% agree, and it's only after the Napoleonic Wars. After the Napoleonic Wars, there was a long peace. After World War II, there's been a long peace between major powers, but powers aren't going to just accept being less powerful and less influential than other people because they decided now is the point in history where everyone stays the same and we all live happy. I think that's...
If we want to upend the current situation in the Security Council, then the only way to do it might be in the aftermath of a gigantic war. One so shocking and fundamentally transformative that humanity rediscovers the spirit of cooperation that it had after World War II, the determination to never let such a disaster happen again.
For 100 years.
And while that would be great for us in terms of having enough content for this channel, it would also be catastrophic for millions, if not billions, of people. The old order, in short, might be right.
He really said, like, World War III would be great content.
Great for us in terms of having enough content for this channel, it would also be catastrophic for millions, if not billions, of people. The old order, in short, might be ripe for renewal. We may just have to be wary of getting what we wish for.
So, it was a great video. I'd appreciate any comments, as always, guys. Hope you're doing well. I know I talked quite a bit there, but I had fun talking. It was very mentally stimulating, that video. But I want to bring up Germany in the mid-late 1800s and early 1900s, okay? So, Germany is ramping up. Napoleonic Wars end, okay? Many decades go by, and then Germany is ramping up. They go to war in the Franco-Prussian War. I'm using Germany and Prussia kind of interchangeably. What would become Germany? Prussia, and then German unification after Franco-Prussian War. And now I'm Germany, right? And I see Britain, I see France. You're more powerful. You have these global empires, right? You have these awesome trade routes. You are more powerful. And in that time, it is ridiculous to just be like, well, yeah, Germany, sorry. Well, a country like Germany will go to war. And then Britain and France, or Britain will say, no, you can't do that. That's against the current world order. Well, I don't like the current world order where you're so powerful and I'm not. Well, sorry. Okay, sorry. Maybe sanction war. Okay? That is not wishing for war and giving up on peace. It is giving up on the delusion that every country will have peace without every single country having the exact same amount of power and influence and standard of life. Until that happens, how can I? It's like it's kind of like this. All right. If I were to go to, like, I don't want a lot of deforestation to happen, right? It's not great for the environment. It's a sad thing to happen. But who am I as America to go to, like, Bolivia or go to Myanmar and say, okay, stop tearing down all your trees, please, it's hurting the environment? Well, okay, your entire wealth, so because you already destroyed all of your trees a lot and made enormous empires and wealth, Now we can't do that because it's the environment now. Okay, well, give me an enormous amount of power and money, and I won't do that. And as much as I don't want the forest to be destroyed, I get what he means. I get what he means. You can't just... It's easy for America to say, world peace, okay? It's easy for France or a lot of countries that are doing well and have a lot of power. But you're going to tell Ethiopia it can't get a coastline? Well, no, because you have to go against war with Somalia. All right, give me some of yours then. Well, no, I'm not doing that. How do you resolve that other than conflict? And so as much as it was like, oh, I guess we just got to... A lot of people are saying the UN is just a, it's not serious. It's just like getting together and putting up votes that don't really mean anything other than just showing your perspective. Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. In fact, I think that's what it should be. And that doesn't just mean like, okay, world war. It just means being realistic. And of course, world peace sounds nice. You can't have that. And when you tell other countries that they can never be as powerful as you, that just... It's like playing a board game or like Monopoly, and you have a ton of money and everything, and just being like, okay, game over. Let's not play against each other anymore. That wasn't great. I think I've said enough in here for you guys to understand my point. I think at this point, I'm just ruining my own argument by putting on more and more examples. So I think the best course of action is be real with each other. Know that countries are unequal. But try and be as good faith as possible in conflicts around the world. And yeah, I don't really know how to achieve that perfectly, but that's kind of my thoughts. So great video. Love y'all. Would appreciate any comments down below, especially on videos like these. You guys are awesome with that. See you next time. Bye, guys.